Hey everybody, welcome back. Ever since the pandemic, we've had an explosion in the use of video conferencing tools. Now, these are chiefly headed up by the likes of Zoom or Teams or Google Chat. But this being Homelab, I wanted to set up something that was self-hosted, secure, and easy to use. And that had to include ease of use for external people, whether they could simply just click a link and join through the browser, or even do something fancy like connect through a SIP client. Well, after searching low and high, I came up with Jitsi. Jitsi is a fantastic application that you can deploy in your Homelab to create private, self-hosted, end-to-end encrypted calls. And it even has things like a native mobile application that makes the whole process seamless and look exactly like you would expect from Teams or Zoom. So let's have a quick overview of what Jitsi is and what it can do, and then we'll dive into deployment, and I'll have you up and running in just a few minutes. So Jitsi comprises of 5 key components. Those are Jitsi Meet. This is a web RTC compatible application, so this is pretty much the bit that you see. And next is the video bridge, which is the bit behind the scenes that communicates between all conference members. And this by default uses port 10,000 with UDP. And we'll come on to that in a bit because we'll want to make sure that that's port forwarded. This is really important for high performance video streams because you'll be wanting to stream that in real time and TCP isn't designed for that. Next is Jikofo, and that's the conference part, which handles all the media interactions between participants. We've then got Jigazi, which is the SIP client. So yeah, that's right. People can use software phones to join your calls, which is great if you need a drop-in replacement for, say, an existing setup. And finally is Jibri, and this is used for recording, which is something we all expect a voice conferencing suite to be able to do. And it's also done for streaming, so when you want to do one stream and broadcast it to lots of people. And if you're wondering how all of this is pinned together, thankfully Jitsi provide a useful diagram. So we won't dive into it too much here because there's a lot to take in. But this is effectively an architectural overview of how those components communicate. And you don't have to use all of the components, you can just use the parts that you want. But for this deployment, I'm going to show you how to deploy all of these, and you can then decide whether or not that's for you. Now, there's a number of ways that you can deploy Jitsi, and I'm going to focus on the Docker deployment today. But do note that you can install this as simply binaries on a VM or a physical machine. And there's even things like unofficial Kubernetes Helm charts that'll get you up and running in no time. Now, thankfully, the Docker installation is quite simple. However, there are a few steps that we need to do first. So let's have a look at those steps, and I'll show you the final tweaked config that I've done for you and will be available on my GitHub. That's going to include things like running this through the proxy because we want to make sure that we've got SSL certificates, because otherwise it throws up a load of errors with web secure sockets. And as we know, things like Chrome are moving to support HTTPS only, so we'll want to make sure that this is in place for longevity. So thankfully, the Docker installation steps are quite straightforward, but we do need to follow them. So the first thing is, and we've done this before, is we need to create an env file. This is an environment file, and this will house all of the secrets and things that will be pulled into the compose file on deployment. So to do this, we're going to download the latest release. We're going to copy the environment file and we're going to tweak it. Next, we're going to run a script that's in there, which is going to generate all of the passwords that Jitsi uses internally. So these are things so the components can talk to each other securely. We're going to create the necessary document repositories. So we're going to have persistence here. We want to be able to remember things like usernames and passwords and recordings and all that sort of stuff. And then finally, I'm going to show you how to tweak the Docker Compose file to make sure that that runs through a reverse proxy so we get SSL certificates. Let's get onto that now. So go ahead and click the latest release link here. That's going to take you to GitHub, and you're going to want to download the source code by clicking this button here. Once that's downloaded, you want to extract that file, and there's 3 parts that we need to get this up and running. Those 3 files are the Docker Compose file, the env.example file, and the gen passwords script. So having a quick look in those files, you'll see that by default, there's no proxy here. So there's no traffic labels, it's just going to run this internally, which you can kind of get away with, but I'm going to assume that you want to expose this to the web, and I would argue that even running this internally, you want to be using certificates. Before we close that down, have a look. there's lots of brackets and parentheses here that we can see need to be filled. And the clue should be here. It's in the env.example file. So within that file, you can see all of these variables that are specified. So we're going to be tweaking the environment file, and then that's going to be called when the Docker Compose file is executed. Lastly, you'll see that there's a generate passwords file. If we go back into the environment file and go to the bottom, you'll see that all the passwords are blank. And when we run this script here, it's going to populate those for us with a complex password, which is great. But feel free to use your own if you wanted to, but I recommend using the script. It just makes life easier. So the first thing we want to do is go and copy those 3 files over to our Docker host. So here on my Docker host, I've copied those 3 files over, and we're now ready to start the deployment process. So the first thing we're going to want to do is to run the generate password script. So let's open up our terminal, let's navigate to this file, and then we're going to run it. So typically when you copy this file over, and I'm talking about the gen password script, it's not going to have execute permissions. So let's go and fix that now with a chmod, and then we're going to say 777 just to make life easier, and then we're going to specify the gen password.sh. So we do that, now we can execute as the home user. So to execute this script, we simply do a /, then we press G and then hit tab and then hit return. No errors were thrown. Let's go and double check our config file now to make sure that those passwords were written to the file. So over here, you'll see that we've got a .env file, and we've also got a .env.backup. So when we ran this script, it backed up the old one, just in case you had any issues or you had a password saved in there that you hadn't got stored anywhere else. That's quite handy. Just remember that the dot in front of a file name in Linux creates a hidden file. So if you're not seeing it, make sure you've got hidden files enabled. But if we open up this file now and we scroll to the bottom, we should see that these passwords are now all populated. Excellent. So that's the first bit done. The next bit, as I mentioned, we're going to have to tweak the default Docker Compose file, and we're going to put some traffic labels in there. So opening up the Docker Compose file, and you'll find this on my GitHub with these changes made. The only bit really that I'm going to tweak is to go down to the labels section. And here you can see that I've specified the traffic labels. I've also put it on my traffic proxy network. If you don't know how to do any of this, please do go check out my previous video where I showed you how to download traffic, install it, and deploy it with SSL certificates. And it's really straightforward, so don't worry about it. You just need your own domain. Now, this will mean that the web component has SSL access, so it's available on port 443 with a valid certificate, and that's great and means you can externalize that. But we do need to add port 10,000, as I mentioned, for the Jitsi video bridge, and we'll get onto that later. The other bit here is to look at the volumes, and we'll want to configure this in the .env just to make sure that it's all consistent. So we want persistence within the Jitsi web, and we want to be able to make sure that we can spin this down and spin it back up, and it remembers everything. So now that we've added the traffic labels, let's head back into our newly created env file, not the backup, and let's tweak a few of these settings. So it's saying that its configuration file will be /Jitsi Meet config. So you can change this to whatever you want, but just bear in mind that whatever's specified here, and I'll show you a config in a moment, is going to be where it's stored on your Docker host. So this by default, the tilde and the slash, is going to put it in your home directory. So on my host, that would be something like this. I go into my Ubuntu, which is my user, and it's going to create a .jitsi-meet-cfg folder, and that will be stored here. If you wanted that somewhere else, you simply change this line. So typically I put it in Docker, and then I create a folder for each of my applications. So in my instance, it would be something like that. So it would store the data in my Docker folder, and then the Jitsi subdirectory. But you can feel free to leave that and tweak it as you see fit. For this example, I'll just leave it as the default just to make sure it's nice and simple, and you can come back and tweak this whenever you need to. So that should give you a clue as to what we need to do as well. So to get this up and running, we're going to need to make sure that that folder structure exists. Otherwise, it could throw a load of errors when we come to deploy this. Other parts that are important in here are to look at the ports and just make sure that you've got no port conflicts. This shouldn't be an issue if we're using traffic as our reverse proxy or any other reverse proxy you're using, because remember, that will be handling all of the termination and then it will be sending that traffic to this container. Lastly, you're going to want to change your public URL. So this should be your publicly available URL and probably a subdomain. I've just called it Meet2 in this case, just because I'm running another instance locally. So put in here your address that you want to use, and that should be fine. Lastly, and this is for when you're running it in a NAT environment, as we are, I'm assuming that you are NATing this, i.e. you have one public IP address and you've got lots of services that are using that. So here you want to specify your IP address of your Docker host. And just for awareness, you can actually get Jitsi to go and do the TLS certificates for you, and you can configure that in here. So it uses Let's Encrypt, much like my video does with traffic, and if you wanted Jitsi to be able to do this itself, then you can specify that here. That might be useful if you're doing something, say a cloud deployment on a minimalist instance and you don't want the overheads of another container to manage, you just want to do it in a single deployment. Jitsi can do that for you. Now, one important feature of Jitsi is obviously authentication. Now, by default, this is going to be open to everybody. So anybody that can reach the web page could create a conference call. Now, you might want that, but you also might want to lock it down. So you can see here that you can enable authentication simply by deleting the hashtag here. So with that deleted, authentication is now enabled, and you've got a few choices after that. So you can enable guests, and I like to enable guests. So that means that when a room is created by an authenticated user, people that don't have accounts can join. And I think that's a good compromise. I want to set up a room and I want people to have a seamless experience joining it. That's what this config will give you. You'll also notice that you can have more advanced setups with Java Web Tokens and also integrate this into an LDAP server. I'm not going to cover that in this video because we haven't quite got there in our Homelab journey yet. But for those who already have a more advanced setup, you can integrate that into that and you would have a seamless authentication experience. So now that we've made those changes and we've saved the environment file, we should be in a good place to spin this up. So let's just quickly recap. We've tweaked the Docker Compose file to include our traffic labels because we want this to run through our reverse proxy. We've added the environment variables which tailor it to our setup, i.e. predominantly our own domain, and things like we want to enable authentication. Now before we deploy this, there's one last thing we have to do, and that's to create those persistent folders. So handily there's a command for this on their website, but it's a straightforward Linux command for making a directory. So we want to copy and paste this command and change this part here to be whatever you specified in your environment file. So I'm going to leave it as the default, but just double check that in case you get any errors. So when we run this, we can now check back in our folder structure to make sure that that's being created. So if I do a refresh here, we should get this folder here. And you can see that within the terminal here, there's a number of subdirectories which are in this folder. And we can see all of those here. So that's excellent, it created them fine. Just make sure that if you change this, it looks right and it's reflected in the environment file. So now we've done that, we're ready to go and spin up the container. So as always, it's a sudo docker compose up-d. And when we run that, it's going to download those images and spin up those containers. So I've already downloaded those images, so it was able to just start them. Let's go and check in Portainer to make sure that that all spun up correctly. Over in Portainer, that looks positive. So let's have a quick jump into the logs just to make sure. So opening the logs for the web, we can see that everything is done. That looks fine. Heading back over to Prosody, and this will be used later when we create our first user. Those logs look fine. If we go back to the Jitsi video bridge, which remember is going to handle all of the video conferencing, that all looks fine. If we go into the conferencing application, we can see that that all looks fine and it's setting up health checks, which just pings each container and makes sure that they're up and running. That looks good. So with any luck, we should be able to hit the browser now and go to meet2.jimsgarage.co.uk and see this up and running. Here goes. Excellent. There we go. We've got it. So welcome to Jitsi. So how do we use this? Well, thankfully, it's really intuitive. You can see that something's being spat out here, and that's just randomly creating names, and these names are what are going to be used as chat channels. So you could just simply click start a meeting. It's then going to ask you to enter your name, so I'll say Jim. It's going to ask you, do you want your microphone and your camera on? Let's put my camera on, just so you can see this working. You'll get a pop-up usually that'll ask you to accept whether you can use this or not. So in the top right in Chrome, you can click that, and I'm going to say allow. So I've allowed the camera, and now you lucky folk get to see two of me. And then if we click join the meeting, it's going to ask for a login. Now that's because we enabled authentication. Now if we'd left this commented out, we'd be straight into that room and we could invite and get on with it. But as I say, I think it's a good idea to set some authentication on this. So let's go and do that. We're going to have to jump back into the command line, but thankfully it's just a few commands and I'll have you up and running in a moment. Now you might be thinking, Jim, what are we doing? Why are we creating a user after we've deployed the container? Well, that's because I don't think there's a way to create a user on deployment. So you could either plug into something existing, like an LDAP solution, or you need to create your users ad hoc afterwards. So that's what we're going to do. So there's two ways you could do this. So you could go back into the command line here and do a sudo docker exec and then execute into the container, or we can do that quite handily through Portainer. I'm going to do the Portainer route just so you can see it a bit easier. The container we need to go into is prosody. So if you click on the console button here and then connect, so to register a user is quite straightforward. We need to run the following command, and that is prosody ctl --config. It's important that you put this here because you need to specify where the config file is. This deployment isn't using its default location. The next one is register. So we want to register a new user. We want to give it a name. In this case, I'm going to call it Jim. And we want to specify the domain. Now, you might think that that would be, I don't know, meet.yourdomain.com. But no, this is the internal domain that Jitsi is using. And you'll see this reference within the Docker Compose file and also within the .env variables. So in this case, it's meet.jitsi. And the last thing is the password. So choose a password and then hit return and it should save this. So I've just used the defaults and we haven't got an error message. So fingers crossed, everything's okay. Now let's jump back into our Jitsi and hopefully we're prompted with a username and password that we can actually complete. So now when I click join on the meeting, it's going to ask me to log in. So I can log in, I can say Jim, and then I can say password. And fingers crossed, we get straight into the meeting. Excellent. So now we have Jitsi up and running with authentication. And we've also specified within the config file that once the user, i.e. me, the admin, the moderator, has created this chat room, we can simply share this URL to somebody else and they can join and it's seamless. They don't have to put in a user account, they just straight in because we've enabled guests. From a usability perspective, this is awesome. Anyway, enough of me on the screen. So now what can we do in Jitsi? Well, why don't I show you that we can just create another user in here. So if I copy this URL up here, I'll just click copy, I'll open a new incognito tab, I'll paste it in and I'll hit return. It's going to ask if we want to allow. I'll say block. And now we can see that we've got Jim here and we've got this other Jim. And so now we've got two participants and they're both in the same chat. I'll now go and grab my phone. I've already downloaded the Jitsi app, but it actually works through the browser on your phone as well, much like you can see on screen now. And I'm going to join the server from my mobile phone. And now when I click join on my mobile phone, you can see that that new user's coming in. Sorry for the feedback. And if I allow my mic, you can see everything's working. So if I leave the meeting on my phone, that's going to lead nicely into the next segment of this video. So let me just end this call. Very straightforward. We can just end the meeting for all. And now we're going to open up port 10,000 to make sure that those video calls are seamless and, more importantly, performant. And there's basically two ways that you can do that. You can either route the Jitsi video bridge through your existing proxy, which is what I do. You can do that by using UDP transport within traffic, or very simply, you could just port forward 10,000 UDP to this container. Now, if we head back into Portainer, you can see that the Jitsi video bridge already has a published port of 10,000. So there's nothing further from a Docker Compose standpoint or a .env file that we need to change. So now we simply need to log into our firewall and do a standard port forward. So here in my firewall, and I use Sophos.xg, do bear in mind this is going to be very different for each firewall vendor, but the process is very similar. Here I've got a destination NAT rule, so because it's approaching my network from an IP address and a different port, it needs to be translated internally. In my case, I'm just forwarding port 10,000 and I'm sending that to my traffic Kubernetes proxy. Now, as I mentioned, you can change this so that it goes to the container itself, i.e. you could put the Docker IP address and port 10,000, or you could route it through your reverse proxy. If you're going to put it through the reverse proxy, you'll need to make sure that that container is bound to port 10,000 and any firewall rules are taken care of. Once that's done, you'll probably have to add a traffic label to that container in the Docker Compose file, and you should be up and running. The reason I do that is just to prevent bad IPs from hitting the video bridge, but it shouldn't really make a difference. It was more just an academic process for me as I wanted to test UDP traffic through traffic. So, with all of that set up and configured through your firewall, you're back into Jitsi and you can do all of the cool things you would expect. So you can do things like raise your hand like you normally would. You can do screen sharing, so I could share any of the tabs or windows that I've got open. Why don't I share my terminal? So here you can see I've got my terminal up and running and it's shared with everyone on this call. And to end it, it's really straightforward. You just click stop screen sharing. And if you want to go off screen or off voice, you can do that as well. You can do tile viewer to put people in a nice grid when you've got lots of people. And I've tested this with over 100 people for some external forums that I run, and it was flawless. Just make sure that you've got a beefy enough computer, and more importantly is the bandwidth. If people have got all their cameras on, that's a hell of a lot of volume. So thanks for watching, everybody. That was a quick video on how to set up Jitsi. I've been using it for a couple of years now with all of my friends, and it's been absolutely solid. It's a great way to have private conversations and a self-hosted environment with all of the mod cons and all of the tools you would expect from a video conferencing suite. If you found this video useful, please remember to comment, like and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one. Take care, everybody.